Thank you, Richard. We turn into Daniel chapter 3. I'm going to read from a sheet this morning called Who Am I? I want you to listen, pardon me. I want you to listen as I read, and you just picture in your mind who you think this person is. Are you ready? I'm a powerful military leader who arises and makes war with the nations of the world. I conquer the world, and authority is given me over every tribe and tongue and nation on the earth. I make war with God's people Israel, and I overcome them. I kill many of God's people with the sword. I lead a remnant of God's people into captivity. I am an absolute monarch. My word is law. I speak proud and defiant words against the Most High God. I issue a decree that the world must bow down and worship an image that I order to be erected. I set the penalty for refusing to worship this image to be death. When I issue the call to worship the image, all the world, all nations, peoples, and languages worship the image just as I decree. The only ones who refuse my order to worship the image are a small group of Jews who claim to be servants of their God. They profess to obey the word of their God and entrust their lives to Him. I sentence them to death for their choice. Who am I? Nebuchadnezzar, what'd you say, Don? The Antichrist. That sounds exactly like him as well, doesn't it? So obviously, you know the context of Daniel chapter 3. It's exactly this. And Nebuchadnezzar is a type of Antichrist. You know, we oftentimes talk about a type of Christ in the Scriptures, that Joseph is a type of Christ in the Old Testament Scriptures. Well, here we have the flip side of that. Nebuchadnezzar is a type of the Antichrist in the Old Testament Scriptures. And so with that, we'll look at Daniel chapter 3 this morning. Now, in a brief review, Daniel and his three friends were taken captive back in Daniel chapter 1. And in Daniel chapter 1, we saw that they were given a test of faith by the food that they were going to be given, that food was against the Mosaic law. And they refused to eat that. They instead asked for food that would be in conformance with the Mosaic law, that often referred to as the Levitical law, as it's presented in the book of Leviticus, things that they could eat and couldn't eat. And then after 10 days of that test, they were found to be in better health than people who were eating of the food from the king's table. And so everyone else then, their food was changed to match what was being fed to Daniel and his three friends. Then, in Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he was troubled by that dream, and he issued a decree that he wanted his wise men to tell him what the dream was and what it meant. And the wise men were confounded by that, and they said, nobody could do this, tell you the dream and the interpretation. Tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. And he said, no, you guys are a bunch of slimy sharks, and I know. Well, that's not an exact quote. I'm paraphrasing. Said, I know that if I tell you the dream, you'll just make up some kind of interpretation. But if you tell me the dream as well as the interpretation, then I'll know I can believe the interpretation. And so he started putting the wise men to death, it appears, because the wise men in terms of those of his cabinet. And when they came around for Daniel and his friends, Daniel asked for time, asked of Nebuchadnezzar personally time to pray to God, and he was given that time. And that night, Daniel was given not only the dream, but the interpretation. And then Daniel went in and told Nebuchadnezzar not only the dream, but also what he was thinking before he had the dream. And then the dream and the interpretation of it. And we finished that up last week. And as a result of that, Daniel was exalted, and he also requested favors of his three friends to be exalted as well. And today, we come to Daniel chapter 3, and Daniel's three friends are going to be put to the test today. So let's start reading the book of Daniel. Let's read verses 1 through 7. I'm just going to read through it and then we'll come back to it. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, now if you're reading from the King James, it says princes there, where the New King James has translated it satraps. It was a governor of a province, and so the New King James has changed that to satrap. I wish they would have just left it prince. Satrap, we don't use satrap. You know, the whole thing between New King James, I know I'm straying here. The whole thing between New King James from King James is to make it more like language that we use today in the New King James. And they changed it from princes to satraps. Makes perfect sense. Anyway, moving on. Verse 3, so the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whosoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So in verse 1, we see that he sets up this image in Babylon. Now, they didn't have Polaroids back then, so obviously this is just an artist's rendering of what the image may have looked like. We really don't know. Some conjecture that it was kind of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of, that it was an image of a man, but it doesn't necessarily say that either. It's just conjecture. When you compare Scripture with Scripture, it appears that the image that will appear in the book of Revelation that will be set up in the temple is the image of a man. Some, though, say that it wasn't a man at all, it was just a spire. Kind of like the Washington Monument, because there were a lot of those in ancient times that would be set up, and they would be set up as a kind of worship for the gods, and so they think maybe it was just one of these spires that was set up, not really the image of a man at all. Whatever the case, I'm not sure that it matters, and it's worth being dogmatic about it, arguing with people about what the thing was. He set up an image, and everybody was to bow down and worship to this image, and it was an image of gold. And this image that he set up was 60 cubits high by 6 cubits wide. Well, now a cubit biblically is 18 inches. It's about 18 inches. It was measured from the elbow to the tip of the finger. And so the average of that is 18 inches. And if you take that and you multiply it out, I've done the math, so you don't have to get your calculators out this morning. But 60 cubits, so 60 times 18 would be 1,080. Now that's in inches, 1,080 inches. And then you divide that by 12 and you get 90. So 90 feet. So the height of this thing was 90 feet. And it was 6 cubits at the base of it. And so 6 times 18 is 108, and you divide that by 12 and you get 9. Good job. You didn't know there was going to be a math test this morning, did you? So 90 feet high by 9 feet at the base. And then everybody was supposed to come around and gather to worship this thing. By the way, this is believed to be about 15 years after Nebuchadnezzar had the dream that Daniel interpreted for him in Daniel chapter 2. So the lapse of time between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3 is believed to be about 15 years here now. So all the Babylonian officials gathered for its dedication. All the people were ordered to fall down and worship this image. And what would happen to whoever refused? They'd be cast into the fiery furnace. There's a word missing there. Immediately, thank you. That's going to come into play here in just a few moments, is why I point that out. They would be immediately cast into the fiery furnace. Where did we see that? Back at verse 6. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the fiery furnace. And when the music played, all the people worshiped the image. Why? They didn't want to die. That's exactly it. But then, we come to another question for ourselves. Why would Nebuchadnezzar do this? Why would Nebuchadnezzar set up this image and make these people do this kind of thing? Actually, there's several reasons. Here, I'm going to go back, though. Maybe you didn't see any. I mean, can you think of any why Nebuchadnezzar might want to do this? Arrogance, pride. Boy, that's a big one. Oh, Dorma, you just went right to, yeah. Hang on to that one. Nobody heard her. Anybody? Yes. A test for, I mean, God would allow it as a test for the Jewish people. All right, I'll put it back up here now. So let's talk about some of these. Why did he do this image and order it to be worshipped, and why such a harsh penalty? Well, one is maybe it was, as hatred for the Jews. Because the Jews worshipped a different God than what the Babylonians worshipped. And, 15 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar paid homage. I don't believe it was conversion on Nebuchadnezzar's part when Daniel gave him the dream and the interpretation of the dream. He paid homage to Daniel's God, but then again, over time, it probably began to wear on him that he's got these people in his kingdom that don't worship the same gods that he worships. And so maybe that was part of it, to weed them out and get rid of them. Set this trap for them so that he can kill them. Maybe it was in rebellion for the dream that he had. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. And so then he decides to build this image, but the image is made what? Entirely of gold. There's going to be other kingdoms come after me that are going to be lesser kingdoms? I don't think so. Maybe that, again, out of his arrogance and his pride, he sets up an image that the whole thing is gold, since he's the head of gold of the image of the dream that he had. Again, pride, arrogance in his own kingdom, his own power, his own wisdom, seeking his own glory. In the end, though, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what Nebuchadnezzar's motivations were. Who's behind this, Dorma? Satan is behind this. Absolutely. So we always have to remember that mankind has their own motivations for things, but behind the scenes, we know that there really is a force of good and a force of evil at work among us. So moving on. Anybody have any comments before we move on from those first 7 verses? The devil made him do it. Well, the devil used him. He had his own motivations, I'm sure. We aren't told exactly what those were, his motivations, but yeah. Any others? All right, moving on to the next set of verses, verses 8 through 12. Again, I'm just going to read down through these and we'll come back to them. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the harp, the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So, almost everybody bowed, except for who? Three. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's their Babylonian names that they were given. We learned in Daniel chapter 1 that they were Meshach, Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah. I probably mixed up the order there, but those were their Jewish names. They're called out by their Chaldean names here, though. Can you picture this? I mean, seriously, put yourself there, and you're one of these three. Man, woman, doesn't matter. This decree's been given. Everybody bows, and you decide to what?
Protest.
Peacefully protest. And how do you do that? By not bowing. By not bowing? I mean, the image in my mind is that it seems like these guys probably stood up straighter. Could you do that? That's my answer too in my mind. I hope so. What's the penalty here? I mean, not just death. Death by being burned to death. I don't know about you. That sounds to me like a very painful way to die. Yeah, I mean, but they do it. They stand up. They're willing to face that kind of death, apparently. Them with all the other Jews who stand up with them. What other Jews? Does this not strike you as odd? When Jerusalem was overrun, Nebuchadnezzar took not just Daniel and the three, there were others, I'm sure, but I wonder what happened to them. Is it possible that it's only Daniel and the three that are still in positions of leadership of those Jewish young men? Maybe that's possible. Maybe they just, the others didn't make the cut and they're not in prominent positions. And that's another thing I wonder about here. When we think about this, who all is here? This appears to be at some type of dedication service to me. It doesn't appear to be all the people of the land of Babylon. It doesn't appear to be that there's millions of people gathered around this image at this time. That it's just the princes, the governors, those that were in positions of leadership in Babylon that are called together here at this time when this thing is initially dedicated, and then these three don't bow to this image. So maybe there's several factors playing in here. I mean, sometimes in our mind it's real easy for us to be to look down on the Jewish people, because of the way that they did turn against God in many ways that are recorded in the scriptures. What I'm saying here, maybe in our mind we need to guard against that kind of mentality at this event. Maybe there really weren't that many Jews there. Maybe it really was only these three that were of Jewish descent, that were in positions of leadership here at this time and decided to take this stand. Just be careful. And by the way, how many? Three. How many characters are central in our story so far in the book of Daniel? 4. Who's missing? Daniel. Did Daniel bow? I certainly don't believe so. So where's Daniel? Well, as being a government official, he may have been off traveling somewhere at this time. Some official business, doing something else. Just in my mind, I tend to believe if Daniel had been here, he would not have bowed down to this image either. We aren't told specifically, we can only conjecture, but that's my thoughts on it. So the Chaldeans came and they accused the Jews before the king. They said, first of all, they, praise the king. They butter up the king. Oh, king, live forever. And they identified Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as not bowing down before the image, that they are Jews that the king had set over the affairs of Babylon. And there are some problems with them. These men do not give regard to the king, in that they do not serve his gods, and they did not bow down and worship the image. Next set of verses 13. Oh, before we move on, questions, comments?
I just want to say, how do you...
Never even thought about Daniel in this story before, huh? Oh, you just thought he was there with these, you thought there were full, oh, okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for that confession, Mary. Sometimes we think we know, and it's good to go back and read and refresh. And remind ourselves this is not just a children's story. It's for us as well to go back and read and study and allow the Holy Spirit to use it in our heart and our lives. So yeah, thank you. Any others? Well, it's kind of, because it's 10. When you look at the human body, like usually it's 1 to 6. Like my foot is 1 foot, so I'm 6 foot tall. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. But the ratio is about 1 to 6, 1 to 7 for the human body. But this is 1 to 10. So you're right. I mean, just like the image that he had the dream of, it does sound a bit top heavy, tall for the base. In the Greek pillars, I'm ad-libbing now, but in the Greek pillars, the columns that would be out front, those were usually designed in that same way, in a basis of 1 to 6 to 1 to 10. If you ever wondered, like, how did they decide how big the column had to be versus the height? That was kind of the same measure that they used, somewhere in that area. All right, moving on, verses 13 to 15. Same thing, I'll just read through those verses. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve the gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? So Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, has them brought before him. And the king asked, Is it true? Now this isn't just... in terms of true or false, when we think of, if somebody asks if something's true, the opposite of that would be false. But there's more to it than this. What is your intent also is what he was asking when he said, is this true? Like, why would you not? Is it your intent to dishonor me? Is it true that your intent is to disobey and dishonor me? Remember, that was the accusation of the Chaldeans when they came to Nebuchadnezzar. He says they dishonor you in that they don't bow and they don't worship the image. And so that's tied up in that. Just wanted you to know that as well. You don't serve my gods and you don't worship the image, and what's the intent there? And so the king gives them a second chance. Why is that so surprising here? Yes, that's why I pointed that out earlier. This is very rare. I mean, this is a monarch, a Gentile monarch, and Gentile rulers were typically not known for being very patient people, unfortunately. I mean, you got one strike and that was it. Off with your head kind of thing. But he gives them a second chance. He said, I will give you. Now, they're going to play again. I'll have them play again. And this time, if you'll bow, hey, we're all good here. We can be friends and we can move on. If not, then, but, verse 6 had said immediately. If they fall down and worship, good. If they refuse, then they will definitely immediately be cast into the lake of fire, into the fiery furnace. I'm getting Daniel and Revelation next hour mixed up here. But then the king says, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Who does that sound like? We've met a king before who made almost an identical statement to that. It's Pharaoh, king of Egypt, when Israel was let out from bondage in Egypt. Who is the God who will deliver you from my hand? What does this say about Nebuchadnezzar at this point? Obviously, he's totally forgotten what happened 15 years ago, give or take, when he himself paid homage to the God of Daniel, which is the same God of these three here. When he said, he is the supreme God, and anybody who speaks against him, his family will be killed and his house will be made a dunghill. But now here's Nebuchadnezzar speaking against their God. Who is your God that can deliver you out of my hand? Man, how quickly he has forgotten. So verses 16 through 18. Oh, any thoughts before we move on? Dorma?
The intent, it sounds like he's working out the
Yes. Right. Yeah, that's why I wanted to point out it wasn't just true or false. Is it true? Are they telling me the truth? It was the intent behind it also was in that question. What is the intent that you would do? Is it true that this is your intent as well to dishonor me? And what's the answer to that? Yeah, I mean, it's a side, but I don't think that was, as you pointed out, that wasn't their primary intent. Yeah, their primary intent was to not dishonor God. Their primary intent wasn't to dishonor Nebuchadnezzar. That wasn't. Verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this manner. We'll come back to that in a moment. If this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They said, we have no need to answer you. That there's a bit lost in translation there. Really, the idea here is when they answered the king was, we don't need to defend ourselves in this. We don't need any defense. Nebuchadnezzar had said, I'll have them play the music again. And basically what they're saying is, don't bother, O king. Don't have them waste their breath playing the instruments again. This is not going to happen. We don't have to defend ourselves. We don't have to be careful about this, is what it says in the King James Version. It says we're not careful in our answer here. In other words, they didn't have to give this any further thought. They had already made up their mind. They had already made up their mind before they were even brought before Nebuchadnezzar. They were not going to do this. They don't need a second chance. They don't need any opportunity to rethink it, to bring any kind of defense. It's not going to happen. We're not going to do this. Again, well, we hope so, don't we, Robert? I mean, the question in our mind is, could we do this? Would we have this kind of resolve for God if we were put in this kind of a situation? You know, it's going to happen again. Just as we talked about at the opening of the message this morning, it's going to happen again during the tribulation period. That there will be people who will have to either stand for Christ or recant and bow down to an image and take the mark of the beast. For those that bow down to the image and take the mark of the beast, what happens to them? Yeah, they're going to the lake of fire. They're condemned for eternity. That's it. There's not a second chance for them. For those who refuse, what happens to them? They're going to be put to death in a horrible manner. That sounds terrible too, doesn't it? But then again, you have to compare that with, you know, it's a temporary pain versus an eternal punishment. And so, you know, in their minds, yes, absolutely. And we'll talk about that in 2 weeks when we come back and conclude this lesson. Yeah, these three are a type of the tribulation saint. Exactly. We talked about the type of Christ and a type of Antichrist here with Nebuchadnezzar, and these are a type of the tribulation saint and the things that they will suffer and the possible outcomes for them. But they said, our God has the power to deliver us from this fire. And of course, there's two possibilities that exist for that. One is that God delivers them out of the fire itself. Now, we know that's what's going to happen, but they don't know that. The other possibility is God does not deliver them from the fire. But guess what? Nebuchadnezzar had said, who's the God who will deliver you out of my hand? If God doesn't deliver them from the fire, and they die in the fire, guess what? They're still delivered from Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And they say, you know what? Regardless, whatever the case is, we don't serve your gods. We're not going to. And we're not going to bow down and worship this image. So, no compromise from them. But also understand no disrespect. As the conversation we had earlier, go back to intent. What was their intent? Was it their intent to disrespect Nebuchadnezzar? No. That wasn't their primary intent. Their primary intent was to not disrespect God. They were not going to disrespect God. They had a clear conscience here. But listen, aren't we supposed to obey governmental authority? Doesn't the Apostle Paul make that clear in Romans chapter 13? That governmental authority is placed in positions over us, men and authority, for our good, and that we are to obey them? Unless. There's a caveat there. What did the Lord Jesus Christ say when he was confronted with taxes? Render to Caesar the things to Caesar, but to God the things of God. And so, yes, we're to be, complicit when it comes to government authority. We're to be good citizens of our community, but when government interferes with our faith and says we have to do something that's contrary to our faith, that's a problem. What did Peter say when he stood before the Sanhedrin? Peter said, if you're asking us to decide whether to obey men or God, what's the choice? We're going to obey God. And so That got them beaten, Peter's response. But then they went away what? Rejoicing. And that they had been found worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus Christ. So just some things to consider there. Any thoughts before we pause in Daniel chapter 3 this morning to pick this up again in 2 weeks?
Did you need to say?
Whichever. Oh, compliant? Yeah. Be compliant to the powers that be. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, because they probably had shown themselves to be very valuable men in service for him. And so that's why he gave them a second chance. Maybe if it had been some others who had stood up in defiance, basically, that they may not have been given this second chance. All right. Are you laughing at me or? Sometimes we're a little harsh in our thoughts about the Jewish people. Yeah. Stiff, yeah. As Stephen. And so are we sometimes. All right. So thank you so much for joining me for the study this morning. Hope you join me in a couple of weeks when I'm back in the pulpit again. Lord.